welcome those who may also be joining us from YouTube here, watching the video. Moorhead Church of Christ Wednesday evening Bible study. We're studying through the book of Job, and tonight we'll be studying through chapter 37. But before we do, just want to give a brief summary of chapter 36. Elihu, one of the friends of Job, makes it a point to show Job in this chapter that God has a purpose in disciplining the godly. It is not to punish them, but to correct sinful behavior. Elihu closes chapter 36 by talking about the power of God displayed in nature. With that being said, we will begin in chapter 37. So, Ryan, do you want to read 1 through 7? Sure. And Jenna, do you want to read 8 through 13, please?
8 through what?
8 through 13. So 1 through 7?
Should I go?
Mm-hmm.
Should I wait?
What?
Should I wait?
It's Job.
Yeah, 37.
But after Luke.
Huh?
Is Luke? Is after Luke?
Oh no, it's an Old Testament, so.
Oh.
Yeah.
Are you using this Bible right
No,
here?
it's, this is not my Bible. Oh.
Yeah, it's
Hey,
page
Joe.
number 399.
Just in time. We're starting out in Job 37. Just get ready to read the text.
What's that?
No. Because this is not my Bible.
I'm not watching the video.
Remember, Job is like right before Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the middle of the Old Testament right there.
Oh. Job what?
Job 37.
37.
Okay.
Yep, whenever you're ready.
Okay. At this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place. Listen closely to the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that goes out from his mouth. Under the whole heaven he lets it loose, and his lightning to the ends of the earth. After it a voice roars, he thunders with his majestic voice, and he does not restrain the lightnings when his voice is heard. God thunders with his voice wondrously, doing great things which we cannot comprehend. For to the snow, he says, fall on the earth, and to the downpour and the rain be strong. He seals the hand of every man, that all men may know his work.
Then the beast goes into its lair and remains in its den. Out of the south comes the storm, and out of the north the cold. From the breath of God ice is made, and the expanse of the waters is frozen. Also as moisture he loads the thick cloud. He disperses the cloud in his lightning, and it changes direction, turning around by his guidance, that it may do whatever he commands it on the face of the inhabited earth. Whether for correction or for his world or for loving kindness, he causes it to happen.
Okay, so what we have here in chapter 37 is a continuation of the speech, Elihu's fourth speech that he began in chapter 36. Elihu continues the theme of God's power displayed in nature. This is being done for Job's benefit, since Elihu, in his estimation, as he's heard the speeches of Job, he believes that Job has disrespected God and questioning God's justice in his great suffering. And so this seems to be sort of the idea of an educating Job about some things. Remember, he's the younger of the four friends, and he believes that unlike the older three friends who sort of missed their opportunity to sort of put Job in his place and get him to realize that the things he was saying was not square with the facts about God. It is Elihu is essentially trying to correct Job's understanding of God, and really a lot of it is showing really the greatness and the power of God, because again, he believes that Job has sort of disrespected God, and the idea is he's questioned God, and he said some things that were pretty hard on God, and it's sort of like, it's almost like putting Job in his place and recognizing that God is above all, over all, Job. So we're going to get into the text here, verse 1. Elihu says, at this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place. And so Elihu in verse 1 is really talking about he's going to say in verse 2, and that is the thunder. That thunder is the idea that it's powerful, that it is something that shakes the earth, and that it is caused by God, who is omniscient or all-powerful. And so the idea is when God thunders, is sort of the earth takes notice. The idea that it is a display of his great power. In verse 2, Elihu says, listen closely to the thunder of his voice. He's talking about God. And the rumbling that goes out from his mouth. And the rumbling here, according to Brown Driver Brigg Hebrews English Lexicon, in this particular verse here, is talking about the thunder. So rumbling, a growling sound of the thunder as sound forth, as sound going forth, excuse me, from God's mouth. So God is the reason for the grand effect of the thunder. Again, the idea is Job, you need to sort of realize this. You see these spectacular things, and it's really God's display of his power shown forth in atmospheric storms. Elihu paints this picture of God unleashing his power in the storms from which man should be in awe of the Almighty's unmatched power. And so Job, the idea is Job, you need to really consider your ways and recognize, that you've been talking about God, and look at how his power is. And the idea is that it's awe-inspiring. Okay. Any questions so far? Verses 1 and 2 before we get into verse 3. Okay. Under the whole heaven, verse 3, he lets it loose, and his lightnings to the ends of the earth. And so the idea, we might think the ends of the earth. The idea here is not that it's sort of square, but the idea that it's at the very, the ends of the earth, as far around the earth to the extreme part of it. So the widespread effect of a thunderstorm is magnificent and awe-inspiring display across the whole world. And of course, we know from our own experience in life, we've seen storms come in, the idea of lightning, and then you have sort of the thunderclap, and boy, it just sort of shakes the house sometimes. It's just a powerful display that's taking place, and it is, from that perspective, the idea is God is behind us, is what Elihu is saying, and it is something that causes trembling, and it's awe-inspiring.
Yeah, I was going to say, it kind of reminds me of, when with Moses, and God was in the mountain, and all of this stuff was going on.
Mount Sinai, and the whole mountain was quaking, and that was done as a display of God's power. When they were getting ready to enter into a covenant, God did that, not because he really wanted to scare them out of their wits, but to get them to realize that he's God, that what they're getting ready to do is enter into a covenant with him. They should reverence God, they should respect God, they should do what God says to do.
And it shows his power that even the animals were afraid to approach it too. So.
Right, yep, very good. Verse 4, Elihu says, after it, talking about the thunder, a voice roars. He thunders with his majestic voice, and he does not restrain the lightnings when his voice is heard. And so when a thunderstorm rolls in, there's impressive flashes of lightning followed by the clap of thunder. And Elihu sees in the thunder God's majestic voice. And we think about these three friends of Job and Elihu, they're not making quite the right assessment about Job. But we've still learned a lot of things from them in terms of they understand, the wickedness of sin. They understand the greatness of God. And, the idea is this is something that, sort of encourages us. The idea is where did that power come from that essentially brings upon these kind of storms? Well, that's the power of God. It isn't just sort of like nature has its own power. God providentially, through his natural laws, does what he does. But the idea is that is a power that essentially comes from God. Okay? Verse 5, Elihu says, God thunders with his voice wondrously, doing great things which we cannot comprehend. And so the idea of wondrously here is strange and beautiful or impressive. And the great power of God is shown in a thunderstorm, and it is beyond man's ability to comprehend. You know, man has tried to measure sort of what a lightning bolt puts out, the electricity in that, and it is far more than what man can imagine. The idea that if you could harness the electricity from a lightning bolt, I'm trying to think of what they said, it would sort of, give electric power to a big city for a year or something like that. There's so much electricity in there. If you could harness that, the idea that this is something beyond sort of man's ability to comprehend, and the idea that of the thunder is something beyond our ability to really understand. And so this is something that is obviously directed towards Job, but if we were to sort of make application here, how is Job's observation about the power of God and nature beneficial for man's consideration? In other words, just in general, as he sort of presents this, what would you see here? How is Elihu's observation about the power of God in nature beneficial for man's consideration?
It goes to show that man can never do any of these things,
Okay.
and in its grand scheme of things, man is usually afraid of a lot of this stuff.
Okay. So the idea is man is not God. Man, one of the things is we man prides himself on scientific and technological advancements, engineering feats, and so we'll say, wow, look at this big thing about how they build the San Francisco Bay Bridge and how they built the dam. I'm trying to think of that big dam
The
and
Hoover?
what's that?
Hoover Dam?
The Hoover Dam and all this, and these are huge, these are amazing feats of man, and yet the idea is that's nothing compared to what God does. But man is impressed with what he does, and the idea is when we're sort of taking into account the idea of lightning and thunder, and the idea is that's even more amazing than the things that man has, because all the intelligence that man has come from God. And so the idea is we need to sort of recognize it. Helps man to really recognize his place with God. Did you have something? Okay. So man can never be God. Man must learn his place in relation to God, who rules over all of his creation, rules over nature. And so instead of like many people today that use God's name in profanity, they're profaning his name and saying terrible things about God, or they're using his name and in vain saying OMG and this and that. The idea is God is to be respected. God is somebody far above man. And when you say somebody's name, you're talking about the person. And so we always want to think about God and the idea of respect and saying what's right about God, and recognizing that as much as we think that we have made great accomplishments in life, that's nothing compared to what God is. And so the idea of reverence and, sort of awe at who God is. Any questions about verse 5? Not. Let's go on to verse 6. Elihu says, "For to the snow," he says, "fall on the earth, and to the downpour and the rain be strong." And so the idea is God is commanding the elements, is what he's saying. The idea is he's commanded, he has control over nature. And Elihu might be the idea in his mind is, God just says, okay, I want it to snow. Okay, I want this, I want this. And again, this, God has sort of laws set up for nature. The idea that nature is acting in accordance with God's will, but this sort of think that God sort of randomly sort of does things outside of that doesn't seem to be, it seems to be that, Elihu sort of thinks that God directs things in the moment, what he wants to take place. But, from what we know about the way God operates, the idea is this is, God's natural laws are in place, but he has the power to set them in place. He has the power over them for them what to do, but they are impressive. And so when it is time to snow, it snows, and when it's time to rain and a downpour, it rains and snows just as God wants it to be. It shows that he is in control of the elements. So again, man's impressed with it. What do you say? Oh, we invented the computer. Oh, we invented the cell phone. Oh, we invented, all these other things. The idea is, well, look what God invented. The idea is how do you think that the Earth stays in its orbit? How do we how do you think we get the heat? Because God made the sun, and He made the sun and put it exactly where it is so that the Earth would not burn up. And so what God does is far more impressive. And so Elihu is really just trying to show us the wondrous power of God. In verse 6, verse 7 about God, it says, He seals the hand of every man, that all men may know His work. And sometimes, as I point out before, sometimes you use one translation. It gets tricky trying to understand exactly what it is. And so when I study the Bible, I use different translations. So when I get to ones that seem a little bit harder to understand, I simply look at other translations to help me have a better understanding of what's being said. And one of the translations I use is the Amplified Bible, and I'd like to read verse 7, so you can look at your translation, and I'm going to read the Amplified Bible here at this verse. It says, God seals up, stops, brings to a standstill by severe weather the hand of every man, and now under His seal their hands are forced to inactivity, that all men whom He has made may know of His doings, His sovereign power, and their subjection to it. And so the idea of this verse is that God's power is incredible. In fact, man sort of falls under God's power. When God exercises His power through the snowstorm or the rainstorm, man's activities are greatly hindered outside until the storm passes. Isn't that amazing? The idea is God does this, and man's like, oh, so much for painting. Oh, so much for doing this. Oh, so much for doing that. We got to wait until the storm passes. Man really falls under the great power of God. And how many people really think of that? The idea is they see the rainstorm, they see the snowstorm, but they don't recognize, hey, this is the power of God. And essentially, we are sort of falling under submission to God's power because we can't work through it. We have to wait till the storm passes. And so man's activities are hindered, and they're hindered until the storm passes. And God is greater than man, and He deserves the reverence from man. And man ought to be able to see when he sees sort of displays of nature and what God is doing. And He's not going to talk about other aspects, the idea of creating all of nature and the trees and the animals, but He's really focusing on sort of the idea of sort of the seasons or the weather and things like that. And really just from that sort of making this picture, the idea is God is in control of all things. We're impressed when the weatherman can tell us what the weather's in 10 days, but God already knows what the weather's going to be in the next 5 years and beyond. And so we get impressed again by sort of what man is able to do, and we forget that whatever man can do, God can do umpteen more times than man is able to do in any of these things. Verse 8 then, Elihu says, then the beast goes into the lair and remains in his den. And so not only is man's activities affected by the storms, but guess what? The beasts as well. They're creatures God has made. And so when the storm hits, man has to sort of hinder his activities outside. And so the animal kingdom as well looks for a place of refuge in their dens until the storm passes. I mean, that just, when we sort of think of it in the way that Elihu's laying it out, that sounds really impressive. And so, we just never tend to really think of things that way. We usually tend to think, well, it's a rainstorm, but we're thinking, well, how did we get the rainstorm? Well, it's because God caused the rainstorm. And the idea is that, we sort of recognize it for what it is, and God has the power to do that. Any questions before we get into verse 9? Verse 9 then, out of the south comes the storm, and out of the north the cold. And so looking at this, man regularly talks about the inclement weather when it comes about, and it talks about, we talk about what the meteorologist predicts and all these things in relation to the weather, but man fails to recognize the weather maker who is behind the awesome effects of the weather conditions that we experience. And so Elihu is really talking about this, and he's talking about the storms, he's talking about the cold, And there's a connection with verse 10. He says, from the breath of God, ice is made, and the expanse of the waters is frozen. And so just when we thought, these are some pretty impressive points that Elihu is making. The idea is imagine the open bodies of water, and now all of a sudden, all of these open bodies of water are now frozen on the surface. I would like to read from Psalm 147. So, Kevin, would you be interested in that?
Psalm 147.
Yeah, we'll read 15 through 18.
15.
This is something similar to what we're talking about here, but I liked what it had to say there. So Psalm 147, 15 through 18. We'll be coming back to Job, but read this for now.
Okay. Psalm 147, 15 through 18.
Yes.
He sendeth forth his commandment upon earth. His word runneth very swiftly. He giveth snow like wool. He scattereth the frost like ashes. He casteth forth his ice like morsels. Who can stand before his cold? He sendeth out his word, and melteth them. He causeth his wind to blow, and the waters to flow.
Okay, again, sort of this really highlights the psalmist, the power of God. And, I don't think we can ever be reminded enough about that, because if we're reminded about the power of God, we'll recognize that, well, we have power, essentially free will, to do what we're going to do. We recognize that free will is really given to us in this life, but ultimately, our power is under the power of God in this life, and in the next life, we stand before God, we'll be held accountable for the choices we make, because God's power is over us, and so we need to make the right choices. If we really love God, if we reverence God, then we're going to do what He says. We're not just going to say, well, God made the earth, and God this, and God this. That isn't going to buy us any kind of relationship with God. What God wants in a relationship, of course, is to come into a covenant with Christ through obedience to the gospel, and really in the idea of living for Him, doing what His word says, so that we are in harmony with Him in all that He says. Verse 11, Elihu continues. It said, also with moisture He loads the thick cloud, He disperses the cloud of His lightning. And so I went to the NIV to read what the New International Version has to say here. It says, He loads the clouds with moisture, and He scatters His lightning through them. And so the idea that God is sort of, the clouds sort of pick up moisture. We're talking about the water cycle, and the idea that, the clouds pick up water from the ocean, and the clouds move inland, and the idea that these clouds can carry that water, and the idea is that at any given point, the idea that, you get the rain and you get the storm, and the idea of the lightning is flashing through the clouds. And so this becomes a grand display of God's power to sort of recognize what God is doing. And, lightning, we can see my neighbor 2 years ago had, like, their apple tree was hit by lightning, and it just destroyed the tree. But I mean, just these things happen, you're like, wow. And there's lots of things that have happened. Lightning has really just devastated. So it's an amazing power. Any questions about verse 11? Now let's go on to verse 12. Elihu says, and it changes direction, turning around by His guidance, that it may do whatever He commands it on the face of the inhabited earth. And so not only is God able to sort of make it lightning when He wants, not only is He able to make the thunder happen, but the idea here in verse 12 is that in talking about the guidance here, the Brown Driver Brigg Hebrew English Lexicon talks about guidance or direction by God of thunder and cloud. And so the idea seems to be that God can sort of, like steering His ship, direct His storms to change course at His will, and He can make the storm go whatever direction He wants because He has the power to do it.
Does that mean it's like maybe like a hurricane or something? Because hurricanes do that all the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, tornadoes, when they happen, they can change course, and, storms happen. I don't know there's anything specific coming out here, but the idea that that he can make a storm direction. So while it may seem like it's going to go one way, it could very likely sort of change directions and go another way. And again, the idea is that's an amazing when you think about it, because we try to predict what God is going to do. And so we might think, well, the storm is going to do this. And even if you listen to the weathermen, they'll talk about a storm. It's like, well, here it looks like, in computer models, it looks like it's going to hit in this direction. But you know, they can only sort of show projections, just like projections of how much snow, how much rains, but that's only projection. And we've got better over the years about doing that, but it's still a prediction. It isn't something like you say, well, you said we're gonna have 2 inches of rain yesterday and we only got 1/8 of an inch, so you know, I'm gonna sue you because I wanted that rain, you know, for my crops. It's not like that. And so, you know, God is going to give exactly what he's going to give when he's going to give it, and he directs all of these things. And we may not always understand what God is doing in terms of the elements, you know, the way God allows some places to get more rain, less rain, but we know it's all under God's power. And God is essentially in control of everything. He loves everyone, but, you know, we also live in a fallen world. And so, you know, we do have storms that essentially devastate people's lives because we live in a fallen world. But that doesn't mean God is busy trying to take people out intentionally. That just happens in a fallen world. Verse 13, Elihu says, whether for correction or for his world or for loving kindness, he causes it to happen. And so the loving kindness here is a word that's very similar to what we use in the New Testament in terms of grace. So loving kindness would be sort of an equivalent in the Old Testament. But here, Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon defines this word as goodness or kindness of God, kindness, loving kindness, condescending to the needs of his creatures. And the idea, this is the idea of, not in a negative way, in a positive way, the idea that one is going to sort of help out of a higher position, sort of help those in a lower position. And so loving kindness to the needs of his creatures, specifically loving kindness in redemption from enemies and troubles. And so the idea that Elihu is teaching this to Job because he wants Job to understand how God works, because he thinks Job doesn't understand how God works correctly, and he's explained it to him so that Job would have greater insight. Kevin?
That expanded translation, did that have to do with the first, you said he caused it to come, whether for correction, was that correction you were expanding on there?
Just the verse in general there, where he's talking about the idea of correction would be sort of the idea of discipline. So one of the things that Elihu's been busy trying to tell Job is that Job is in the midst of great suffering, and he's been busy telling Job, listen, one of the things that God does is he uses divine discipline for those who are his people to correct them. So if they're in sin, to get them to repent of their sins so that he can restore the blessings.
Okay.
Yeah. And Albert Barnes on this verse, in his commentary, Barnes notes on the book of Job says, quote, the rain or storm are entirely under God's hand, like lightning, Job 36 and verse 30, and designed to accomplish his purposes of mercy and of justice. Job should not be questioning God. This is how Elihu feels about it. Questioning God, you're wrong, Job, because God is going to do what he does. And if you're suffering, he's doing that because he's trying to help you to see you need to change your ways because you're in sin. And when you change your ways and come to repentance, then God essentially can bless you. Okay, any other questions before we get in the next section? Verses 14 through 20. Vanessa, would you like to do some reading?
Mm-hmm.
Or pass?
You
No,
said-
I'll pass them.
You want to pass? Okay.
Which verses?
14 through 20. You want to read those, Kevin?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Chapter 37, 14 through 20, you said?
Yep.
Okay. Hearken unto this, O Job, stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. Dost thou know when God disposed them and caused the light of his cloud to shine? Dost thou know the balancing of the clouds, the wondrous works of him which is perfect in knowledge? how thy garments are warm, when he quiets the earth by the south wind. Hast thou with him spread out the sky, which is strong, and as a molten looking glass? Teach us what we shall say unto him, for we cannot order our speech by reason of darkness. Shall it be told him that I speak? If a man speak, surely he shall be swallowed up.
All right. So in verses 14 through 20, Elihu will confront Job with questions that are designed to elevate God. Now, again, this man has heard all the speeches of Job. Job has not essentially disrespected God. Job is a man who suddenly was under great suffering, has been under great suffering. He doesn't understand why, and the typical thinking of the day and what the three older friends are is, Job, if you're suffering, you sin. That's all they had in their mind. If you're suffering, you sin. Connect the dots. All you have to do here, Job, is repent, and everything will be good. But at the beginning of the book, we recognize that Job is talked very highly of, and that God himself has chosen Job essentially as a test case to show Satan that Job was not following him strictly for blessings. And so God allowed him to essentially remove his wealth, his family, his health, and God was saying, my servant Job essentially is going to maintain the integrity of his faith. And Job has done that. But see, Job doesn't know that he is essentially being used to prove this point. All he knows is he didn't hear the conversation up in the upper regions of heaven. He didn't hear the conversation. All he knows is that he's suffering, and he knows that he isn't suffering because he sinned, but he doesn't understand why. And so he's frustrated. He is essentially thinking God has been unfair to him, but he has never really disrespected God. But that's what Elihu has in mind when he's heard some of the things that Job has said. So when we have that and we bring that into this, we recognize why Elihu keeps talking about the greatness of God. It's not that Elihu doesn't know that. It's not that Job doesn't know that. But the idea is he believes Job needs to hear this because he believes that Job has a low estimation of God. And he needs to just recognize, Job, you are under God. You're small. He's big. He's got power. You need to really know your place in the situation. That's why we're talking about the greatness of God, not just because he wants to talk about it so that he can say this to the Job and the friends there. Okay, verse 14, Elihu says, listen to this, O Job, stand and consider the wonders of God. And so when he uses the word stand here, the Hebrew word here in the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon is saying essentially for him to sort of stand still, stop, be attentive. And the idea of pay attention and listen carefully. In other words, Job, I want you to get the maximum benefit of what I'm saying. I want you to hear me out here so that you can appreciate what I have to say to you. And Elihu is demanding of Job his attentiveness to the questions that he is about to pose to him. So when we think about that and we think about the wonders of God, okay, the idea of God's amazing powers that inspire awe, when we think about that, how might Elihu's words towards Job for his consideration of these wonders be a good line of argument for atheists? Think about that. He's going to give Job some things for him to consider. And he's going to give some things really to consider about, again, from nature and what happens with the lightning and the clouds and wind and all this stuff. How might that be something that may be beneficial in trying to help atheists to see God? If there's no God, then how are all these things taking place? How are we getting the lightning? How are we getting the thunder? How are we getting the storms? And of course they're going to say, well, it's all happening by itself. And the problem with that is they want to create a world without a creator. In other words, everything made itself, and here we are, and wow, look how perfect it is. We sure are lucky. And now these storms, they operate just on their own. They just sort of do whatever they're going to do. But it doesn't snow in July, and usually it doesn't. For us here, it doesn't snow in July, and normally doesn't rain in January. It snows. The idea is everything is on a perfect cycle. And how do you explain sort of all of this consistency and all of these powerful things that happen? The idea that it's just happening by itself. If you walk through it and think through it, it really doesn't make any sense. The idea that you could have so much perfection and you could have this great displays of power, and then you sort of look the other way and say, yeah, but there's no God. Okay, I mean, this is all being presented because, of course, Elihu believes in God. He's given credit to God, and Job also believes God. The idea is none of this would take place without God. Any questions or comments about that? All right. Verse 15, Elihu says, he's talking to Job, do you know how God establishes them and makes the lightning of his cloud to shine? And them is talking about, of course, the wonders of God in verse 14. And so the series of rhetorical questions Elihu now asks Job are designed to inspire awe and reverence for God, who is the creator of everything, has power over everything. And in essence, we're going to have Elihu telling Job here, saying, listen, do you know how God did what he did in relation to establishing the clouds and bringing forth lightning to flash from them? And while you can sort of know that God made the clouds and know that God makes the lightning come from the clouds, what you cannot know is how God does it. So the rhetorical questions, of course, are for emphasis, and the idea is that the answer is no. Job, you don't know. And this is done essentially to sort of humble Job. You're questioning God. You're saying, I want my day in court with God, and I could make my case against God. The idea is I could show that that I'm in the right, and essentially I'm being treated unfairly. And the idea is, Job, you don't know this. Only God knows that, and this is the same God that you're making these demands of, and you're challenging. Okay. Verse 16. Elihu goes on and says to Job, do you know about the layers of the thick clouds, the wonders of one perfect in knowledge? And so Elihu is essentially saying to Job, explain how God suspends the clouds in the air. The one who, talking about God who is perfect in knowledge, and the idea is Job, you don't have the foggiest idea. You don't have a clue. The idea is he's humbling Job. Job, you've been talking pretty big talk in your speeches. You've been challenging God. In my view, you've been disrespecting God. But look, you can't even answer these questions because only God can answer these questions. You're not God. You don't know. Verse 17, talking to Job, he says, you whose garments are hot when the land is still because of the south wind. And so Elihu wants Job to explain how the sultry air of the southern winds makes his clothes hot. And the answer is, Job, you don't know. You don't know how God makes the wind blow. You don't know how he uses sort of these temperatures and things to sort of make you be hot and maybe stifling hot in these clothes, because you're not God. Okay? Verse 18, Elihu continues, can you with him spread out the skies strong as a molten mirror? And I looked at the Amplified Bible. I looked at a couple other translations, but I liked what the Amplified Bible said here. It says, can you, along with him, spread out the sky which is strong as a molten mirror? And in ancient times, they didn't have mirrors like we have in our bathrooms today. So we hear that word, and they had something that was a far cry to that. So they would use bronze or something like that, and they would hammer it out. And the idea is that you'd have this basic reflection out of a really polished, hammered out plate of bronze. And so the idea is you could actually use that to your benefit. And that's what we were talking about, sort of the mirror, the kind of mirrors that they have. But apparently in the question posed to Job here in verse 18, Elihu is asking if Job could assist God in spreading out the skies as if God needed Job's help. And the answer, of course, is no, Job, God doesn't need your help to spread out the skies. God does this on his own. And this phrase here at the end, we talked about as strong as molten mirror, is talking about the skies. And Don Shackelford, in his Truth for Today comment, Job says the skies are like the strength of a molten mirror. Molten, according to Brown Driver's Rig Hebrew English Lexicon, is talking about a flow or a pour, sort of metal. And the mirror, the idea of sort of a reflection. And so, the idea that the sky is sort of something that is stationary, something that God has put into place. Now, remember that the words that Elihu is saying here are not necessarily inspired. This is an inspired account of what Elihu told Job, but not all of the details are in harmony with what the Word of God says. In other words, it is an accurate reflection of what was said, but because they didn't have any revelation of all, they didn't have the revealed Word of God. God just spoke in dreams and things like that. This is before the Old Testament was even written. They had bits and pieces of information, and some of the things that they had, they misunderstood, like the idea that suffering meant you sin. Well, we know in the New Testament that from what James tells us, that sometimes God allows us to go through trials for the strengthening of our faith. And so they don't have all the information. And so Elihu's impression is that the sort of the sky, sort of the planet, everything is sort of fixed in place, but it really isn't. Okay? All right, let's go on to verse 19. Elihu says, teach us what we shall say to him. We cannot arrange our case because of darkness. And really what we have here is Elihu using some sarcasm. The idea is Job, remember Job is somebody who is well respected. He was a man who stood in the gate. He counseled people. He helped people. He's a very righteous man. But all of his friends, once they believed, his suffering was a result of sin, a lot of the people in the community lost respect for Job. And even his three friends have lost respect for him. And so the idea that they're using sarcasm with him here. And Don Shackelford, in his Truth for Today commentary in the book of Job, here in this verse says, using sarcasm, Elihu invited Job to teach him and the friends what to say to God. Since Job did not understand the workings of God in nature, he could not presume to understand how God was working in his own life. It was futile for Job to arrange his case before God while in darkness. And the idea of darkness here, Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon, the idea of is figurative of ignorance. In other words, Job, you don't know. What do you mean you're going to present your case to God? You don't know God. You don't know the workings of God. You don't understand these things. And essentially, because of that, you're really unqualified to make any kind of case before God because you don't know. Verse 20, Elihu says, shall it be told him that I would speak? Or should a man say that he would be swallowed up? In this verse, Elihu shows the foolishness of debating God and what he does, as Job seemed determined to do in his speeches. Elihu says the man who would do this with God would be swallowed up. And Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon says this is figurative of the idea of destroy. In other words, you're going to go up against God. You're going to debate God. You're going to make some kind of, you're on a suicide mission because God is going to win. You're going to be destroyed. Okay? So he's really sort of being sarcastic with him. He's really trying to show Job, you're really out of line with God. Okay? Any questions before we go in the last section? Okay, we're going to read 21 through 24. Ryan, would you want to read that last bit for us?
And now men do not see the light which is bright in the skies, but the wind has passed and cleared them. Out of the north comes golden splendor. Around God is awesome majesty. The Almighty, we cannot find him. He is exalted in power, and he will not do violence to justice and abundant righteousness. Therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise of heart.
All right. Elihu is going to finish with really trying to get him to sort of, again, so the idea of, we're talking about the great power of God, the idea of recognizing God's place in things, and sort of Job's place in this. And so in verse 21, New American Standard says, and now men do not see the light which is bright in the skies, but the wind has passed and cleared them. And so this doesn't really bring out in the clarity that probably this verse could have. And the New International Version says, now no one can look at the sun, bright as it is in the skies after the wind has swept them clean. The idea that the clouds are taken away. You know what happens if you were to look in the direct sunlight with your eyes for a period of time? I don't know how long, but essentially you could be blind. I don't know how long it is to look in the direct sun for whatever time period. You know, even when they have eclipse, they're wearing special glasses to be able to watch, because of the power of the sun, the brightness of the sun. You could essentially be blind. But there's a point being made here. And the point is that in relation to God in verse 22, that just as one cannot look at sort of the sun without the cover of a cloud, no one can behold the essential glory of God, because even that would be more unbearable than looking at the uncovered sun. In other words, God is that much more. His essence, his essential glory. The idea is that becomes something that would be devastating. And remember this in the Old Testament, that Moses wanted to see God's essential glory. He asked God about it, and God makes a point. I don't have the scripture here for me, but the idea is he wants to see it. God's telling him you can't do that. The idea is if you see God's essential glory, essentially you're going to die. And so what he sees is a theophany, so a visible manifestation, something that God sort of projects or presents that you can see without dying. Okay, and so, you know, Elihu is saying this is even worse if you were to be in the presence of God. Remember, Job wants to come into the presence of God. He wants to make his case in a courtroom with God, how he feels like he's been unjustly treated. He wants to be able to sort of debate with God and show that. The idea is, Job, you don't want to end up in that place, because it could be very bad for you. Verse 22, Elihu says, out of the north comes golden splendor. Around God is awesome majesty. And so looking up this Hebrew word, zahab, in Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew lexicon, is talking about gold. And it says, out of the north comes gold. And so here, the golden splendor coming from the north is figurative description of the sun's brilliance in the sky, cleared of the clouds. And so the idea of it sort of being golden. And then he makes a point, Elihu makes a point that the majesty of God is something even greater. The idea that it encircles God is something greater than sort of seeing the magnificence of the sun. Any questions about that before we get to verse 23? Okay, he says in verse 23, the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is exalted in power, and he will not do violence to justice and abundant righteousness. Elihu is speaking of the greatness and power of God, tells Job, because of these things, the Almighty will not treat anyone unjustly. Job needs to know his place. The idea that you would even accuse God of doing something like that, God's not going to do it, because he's the Almighty. Almighty here, the Hebrew word is shaddai. It means all-powerful, and this has been used multiple times in the book of Job. God has all this power because he is the Almighty, and because he's exalted in this high position. He is not going to do anything really to sort of pervert justice to anyone. He's not going to treat anyone unfairly. And so, Job, you have it all wrong in terms of your accusations against God. Finally, verse 24. Elihu says, therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise of heart. And the idea here is the idea of reverence. The idea is knowing who God is. Men are going to have reverence for God. They're going to give him what is due to him. And then he talks about a different kind of people in the second part of the verse. He does talk about God. He does not regard any who are wise of heart. And in the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon, the word means, the Hebrew word here, shakam, means shrewd, crafty, cunning. It's talking about the wise of mind in their own mind. And the idea is those who essentially have their own sense of what they're smart and they maybe think they're smarter than God. The idea is God is not going to acknowledge that. And Wayne Jackson, in his book about the book of Job here, in his little commentary, says, Elihu suggests in conclusion that men who are wise do therefore fear, have reverence for God, and those who consider themselves to be wise of heart are not regarded by God. This final clause may mean that Jehovah does not regard, that is, respect the wishes of those who would submit his conduct to their scrutiny or who demand that he answer their questions. The end. Any questions or comments?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you read 23 as you have it?
23, yep.
Mhm.
The Almighty, we cannot find him. He is exalted in power, and he will not do violence to justice and abundant righteousness.
Okay. What's it? I have a King James version here. There's just a word that is at the front that's just odd to me. There's an emphasis on the word, and it says, touching the Almighty, we cannot find him out. He is, emphasis again, excellent in power and in judgment and in plenty of justice. He will not afflict. I'm just wondering if you have anything involving that additional word at the front and why there's emphasis on it.
Well, different translations, using the Hebrew language and talking about the scholars looking at that, they choose sort of different wording. The King James Version sort of predates trying to think of what I'm trying to talk about. It predates where they found all of the scrolls, the
Dead Sea Scrolls?
Dead Sea Scrolls. Why am I drawing a complete blank? The Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls, King James is written really using a lot older manuscripts that we had, I think from the 12 and 1300s. By the time they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1947, what they do is they find a whole lot of scrolls that are even older than those, and the older they go back, they get closer to the originals, the more accurate they are. And it's probably the difference because like the New American Standard is a revision of the American Standard written in 1901. This is the New American Standard version I have is 1995. The idea it incorporates all of these new manuscripts, and so the idea is the accuracy is probably better with the translations after the Dead Sea Scrolls are used. And so I can't tell you why they used the word that they did. What we could do is look at the Hebrew lexicon, and we could draw a conclusion. But I can't tell you why they use that particular word, and why it's sort of different than this. It's just what they use based on those manuscripts.
So it's simply an inclusion perhaps off the grammatic rules
Yeah.
used at the time with the manuscripts they had
And-
at the time.
And if you look at like the Koine Greek of the New Testament or Hebrew, it's from the perspective. If you were to see sort of the actual text, it's very sort of choppy. Okay, so what happens when you have a choppy? The words are said, like in the Greek, where it talks about in John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes him shall not perish and have eternal life. You're going to have the words, something like loved, for, God so willed, and this is how and it's all sort of has to be smoothed out in English, if you follow what I'm saying
Yeah.
here. And this is sort of what we're dealing with a lot of this, the idea of this, you're talking about word arrangements. Okay, does this need to go here? And what word are we going to use? When the scholars look at it, they have maybe a Hebrew word that means roughly a sentence, and they have to pick one or two words that are what they believe an accurate reflection of that sentence. And that's why a lot of times when I'm studying, I'm going to the original languages and looking at the words, because I'm chained to the text, I'm chained to the English words, but the English words are from the Hebrew, the Old Testament, they're from the Greek in the New Testament. That's why you go back to the word size. What did they actually try to say here? So here's what the translation says, here's what the actual Hebrew word means.
So Koine Greek and Hebrew are more of a particle and particulate based language rather than a vowel and consonant based, like what we have in English today. More like almost the only language I can think of that I could accurately draw a comparison is Japanese.
Yeah, it's right. It's very different than what we're accustomed to. And so when you were actually look at the text, you, as a scholar, somebody who understood it, you could see the challenges, and that's why the translations, the words are somewhat this way or this way. The idea is what is the exact word order, and a lot of times it becomes fairly clear, and sometimes not as clear, because you got to understand the context, and sometimes, so it's the difference between translations. I read other translations because the New American Standard in some cases, well, the wording is reflected there. The idea is it's hard to pull from it what exactly is being said, and so I'm looking at these other translations. New American Standard is probably a 10th or 11th grade reading level. New International Version, 8th grade level, to sort of help with the interpretation of what the verse is saying. A lot of times, if you don't have the clarity, you're trying to say, well, this is what the author seems to be saying, which doesn't mean that's exactly what he's saying, but this is what it seems to be after you look at the languages, you look at the different translations, you look at maybe some commentaries. This is what it seems to be saying. So sometimes it's not really easy. Job has showed itself, the book of Job seems to be challenging in certain places, really trying to sort of get, because you can go one way with it, you can go another way with it, like trying to figure out, okay, which, in relation to the context, which one seems to fit better in the overall context, this way or this way. So it is kind of a challenge.
Yeah, like verse 7, I had no comprehension of what that meant. He sealeth up the hand of every man, that all men might know his work.
Right?
I assume that to mean in some other way, like he physically afflicts.
Yeah.
I didn't realize I had to do.
So the idea is sort of sealing things up, so the idea is now they can't do their work because of the storm. They're essentially, their hands are tied. Why they use the word sealed up, I mean, the idea is sort of, everything is sort of the idea of sealed. The idea is they're not going to be able to do what they want because things are sealed. It is what the Hebrew word indicates. But if we sort of get the gist of what he's saying, the idea is they're going to be unable to do their work. So they're prevented by seal, I guess, is what the intention is. Well, we need to finish for now. We can talk a little bit more about this after we get done, but it's 10 after 7, so we need to bring the class to a close. So I want to thank those who join us via video on YouTube. Hope the lesson will be a blessing to you. Lord willing, we plan to have another video next week. God bless you all.